Fire Emblem Engage has now been out long enough that a general understanding of the meta has started to solidify. What builds are good, what units are good, what builds are memes, what units are memes, what your army composition could be. Different people have different opinions about this, but in general, there's an understanding of what good and bad ideas are to do with your units and your army. As such, any Fire Emblem YouTuber worth their weight in clickbait has to come up with some sort of controversial hot take about how everyone is wrong about the meta. Bearing that in mind, I humbly present to you my hot take. Kagetsu is overrated. Wait. Before you leave me in comments, I don't think Kagetsu is a bad unit. Actually, you know what? Go ahead. Leave those mean comments. It helps me in the algorithm. But then afterwards, come back. Because I don't think Kagetsu is a bad unit. I just think that he is overhyped. I mean, for God's sake, I've heard people say that he's the second coming of Ryoma, which is just an absurd notion. Kagetsu is an incredibly powerful, low-investment unit who basically every playthrough should make use of, but I don't think he's the best unit in the game. And no, this isn't going to be some sort of pedantic argument of Seedal or Hortensia being better because I like warp skipping and dancing better than combat. For the purposes of this video, the only units I'm considering are combat units. The argument for whether a dedicated warper, a dancer, or a combat unit is best is an argument that we can save for a different time. With that in mind, I believe that the best combat unit in Fire Emblem Engage is Panette. In order to explain why, I feel like we should take a deeper look at both units. Bear in mind that when analyzing units, I assume a no DLC playthrough. This is for two reasons. The first is that the Maddening Mode campaign seems to be balanced around a no DLC playthrough much more so than around a DLC playthrough. Chapter 11 and Chapter 22 are the two big ones people point to, but I would argue that the majority of the Soul Mark as well is really tightly balanced around them knowing you will have access to specific emblem wings and not any other ones. The second reason is not everyone has access to the DLC. I strive for my unit analyses to be accessible to a general audience. With all of that out of the way, let's take a look at Kagetsu. He joins midway through Chapter 11 as a swordmaster with kind of bonkers stats. 17 strength and 22 speed are the standouts, but around the board he's got pretty good bases in just about everything. Heck, for a physical unit, 5 base magic is pretty impressive as well. These stats become even more impressive when you take a look at his personal bases and realize that the majority of his stats are coming from those, allowing him to reclass into basically whatever role your army needs and perform adequately. This is important because at this point in the game you have access to up to 6 second seals, meaning that the class a unit starts in is much less important than their personal stats, as if you desperately need a Great Knight, you can send any of your units into Great Knight instead of just being stuck with Bunei. The fact that Kagetsu has both good strength and good speed is a bit of an outlier in Engage. Most units in Engage either have terrible speed but strong one of the attacking stats, or strong speed but terrible their attacking stat. This means that if you want to use a unit long term, you generally have to either fix their strength or their speed. For example, Citrine has overkill magic, but she is as slow as molasses. On the flip side, Lapis is fast enough to double most enemies, but is going to be dealing very little damage to them unless you do something to increase her attack power. While Kagetsu does definitely benefit from inheriting Speed Plus just to push him over the top for doubling some of the faster enemies on Maddening Mode, he doesn't need it, and as such he's incredibly flexible. I think the general consensus is to send him into Wyvern, although since this requires you to wait until you have Ike, some people have suggested sending him Bone Knight or Paladin so that you can make use of him right away. That's not to say that he's unusable in Swordmaster, but it's definitely not a good class for him, and he wants to get out of it as soon as he can. Panette joins a couple of chapters later in actually a very similar situation to Kagetsu. By this I mean that her stats are impressive, but her class is not. She wants to leave Berserker as soon as possible. The most immediately noticeable difference between Kagetsu and Panette is Panette does not have good speed. While some of this is the result of the classes they start out in, her personal speed is still 4 points less than Kagetsu's, and with a 25% personal speed growth compared to his 50%, the gap is only going to widen going forward. Worse still, a lot of the advantages she has in strength are a result of the Berserker class. When looking at their personal stats, she only has 1 more point of personal strength than Kagetsu, and even in Swordmaster he has a 50% strength growth, which means that if you did the Lucina paralog, it's not unlikely he's leveled up strength at least one time before you get Panette. All in all, it's actually looking really bad for Panette compared to Kagetsu. With this in mind, you may be wondering why I said that I think Panette is better than Kagetsu, other than of course the obvious clickbait benefits of saying that. Well, for that we have to look at some of the more unique aspects of Panette's kit. First off, inherent knife access means she can go either Thief or Wolf Knight, although I don't think either of these are good options for her on Maddening mode. She certainly has the strength to make Wolf Knight work, especially with forged daggers, and theoretically Wolf Knight growths could eventually fix her speed, although it would be slower than Amber's since she gets less time in it. But for the majority of the mid-game she wouldn't be doubling, and if you're not doubling as a Wolf Knight, I don't really know what the point of going into that class is. Ultimately it feels like spending the resource of a second seal just to make one of your units perform worse than they would if you hadn't. Dagger access is theoretically a benefit, but it's such a minimal one that I don't really count it as a point in her favor. No, instead the aspect of her kit that I think is most important is her personal skill. It's a free 10% extra crit just for being below max HP, which is huge. When combined with her absurd strength and HP bases and growths, this can translate to some of the highest physical damage in the game. If you're at all tuned into Fire Emblem, you know what I'm talking about. You forge and engrave a killer axe, slap Ike on Panette for wrath access, and watch her destroy all enemies with guaranteed critical hits. In the mid-game, with Ike's help, she can be one of the only reliable enemy phase units on your team, and once you enter the late game and have the ability to re-inherit Vantage and hold out onto her, she becomes nigh unstoppable. Theoretically, she can function perfectly fine like this in Berserker, her home class, but it is generally advised to go Warrior, specifically because then you have access to killer bows as well, both for flyer effectiveness and 2-range crit options. Warrior's dex, speed, and defense are slightly better, but those aren't a huge factor here. Now, since they both join at the point in the game where second sales are pretty readily available, theoretically Kagetsu could just slot into Warrior or Berserker and do basically the same thing that I'm describing with Panette. It would take him more bond fragments, sure, but that's not a huge deal, is it? Well, there's a couple of reasons that Kagetsu functions worse in this role. He doesn't have the inherent plus 10 crit from his personal skill that Panette gets, which is already a huge L on his part. The differences in their HP and strength growths also hurts Kagetsu. Because every point of strength is 3 points of expected damage, the slight differences in their strength growths actually makes a huge difference over time, especially when you consider the fact that this is going to be one of your only enemy phase units, and so is going to be getting more experience than the rest of your army on average. When you add Panette's significantly better HP growth, allowing her to more successfully leverage this as an enemy phase build and therefore snowball more easily, it becomes pretty clear that Panette is better suited for this role than Kagetsu. Now you might ask, why not just use both? After all, you can have 2 warriors, and 2 warrior crit builds is better than 1. And well, that's because you only have 1 Ike to go around, and Wrath costs 2000 SP to inherit. Sure, you could sink a bunch of SP books from the Whale into inheriting Wrath, but then you don't have Resolve, and so you're worse at enemy phasing. Are you going to also sink SP books into inheriting Resolve? Remember, Kagetsu only has 1000 SP at base. Panette has 1500, which is better, but you want to save those for Holdout Advantage. And speaking of Holdout Advantage, you only have 2 skill slots. If you're inheriting Wrath and Resolve for the mid-game, what are you going to do about the late game when you generally want Holdout Advantage combined with Wrath and Resolve? In this instance, Kagetsu's flexibility instead of specialization actually hurts him. He can fill any role in your army well, but he can't be the best at this particular role. And I am of the opinion that this particular role is the most important role in your army. You see, endgame maddening enemies are power crept to hell. There's generally only 3 ways to deal significant amounts of damage to them. Deal effective damage, get a critical hit, or use magic on an enemy class that has a low res cap. The majority of the maps in Engage's endgame are fairly warp skippable, and by far the best boss killer is a crit build Panette. Now, if you don't like warp skipping maps, or for the maps where warp skipping is just not really feasible, that's also fine. The Holdout Vantage Wrath Resolve combo is still going to do a ton of work in the endgame. In fact, getting a guaranteed or near guaranteed crit with Panette is one of the best ways to kill enemies. The biggest downside, of course, is that multiple 1-2 range enemies can throw off your holdout vantage strats. But most groups of enemies, even in the late game, do not have more than one 1-2 range person in them. So if you delete them on player phase, then allow Panette to delete all of the other units on enemy phase, bada bing bada boom, you're done. This is also far enough in the game that the difference between Panette's strength growth and HP growth and Kagetsu's strength growth and HP growth has really started to show. In my maddening playthroughs, my crit warrior tends to reach level 20 around chapter 20 or 21, depending on how many paralogs I do and who I'm feeding experience to. On average, at this point, Panette will have 6 more points of HP and 4 more points of strength than Kagetsu. That does not sound like a huge difference, but it is. An extra 12 points of damage on a crit can be the difference between killing and not killing an enemy, and if you are relying on killing every enemy with Vantage once holdout has been activated, you can't afford to not kill someone. The HP is less of a big deal than the strength, it just makes setting up Vantage and holdout percentages a little more awkward for Kagetsu, but it's fairly manageable. And of course, the personal skill is something that Kagetsu can never replicate. In games like Fire Emblem, and especially in player phase heavy games like Engage, I think it is much better to specialize in one thing than to be decent at a bunch of things. And Panette very much specializes in what I think is the most powerful build in the game. Thanks for watching. If you disagree with me, go ahead and leave a comment as to why, and I will respond with a thoughtful analysis, by which I mean I will write "Stay mad, Panette is the best," and then a emoji of someone sticking their tongue out at you mockingly, because I am mocking you for believing that Kagetsu is better than Panette, when he is so clearly not. Please subscribe, bye!